of social and economic justice, and so welcome. So tonight's event, I'm not going to spend much time talking about it, but this is sponsored today by UNAC, so we're really grateful to have you all here, and especially to have Vijay Prashad, who's really a very respected thinker and writer on the topic tonight. So we'll be hearing about the events in Libya, and a lot of us, as the Arab Spring and the events in the Middle East came about, we all felt a lot of hope, I think, in seeing some democratic movements rise up. But with the development of the U.S. war policy and the most recent bombings in Libya, I think a lot of us are really beginning, or not beginning, but really questioning what is the direction and where is this headed. So Dr. Prashad is going to share his thoughts. He's a professor and director of international studies at Trinity College and author most recently of The Darker Nation, People's History of the Third World. He's a frequent contributor to Counterpunch, where I think a lot of us read his writing. And most recently today.
Too many acronyms.
Too many acronyms. All right. Well, I will move along because we have a wonderful speaker tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr.
Okay, yes. Yesterday I sent that essay to Alexander Coburn, and he said this is approaching wonkiness because there were so many acronyms. And of course the most dreaded acronym of all in the United States is the UN, which hated beyond words. And then of course AU, the African Union, another dreaded acronym. BRICS, the downfall of America. So I'm sorry for that. I'm very happy to be here because I think the United Nations Anti-War Committee is essential. And I want to say a few words of why I think it's essential, at least two reasons why I think it's essential. One, this country suffers from a kind of addiction to hopefulness. And when Obama came on the scene and said that, we can have a division between the good war and the bad war. In other words, that Afghanistan was the good war, and the problem with Bush was that he distracted us from the good war and took us into the bad war. Essentially, that was the limit of Obama's anti-war position. And it was the limit, in many ways, of the Democratic Party's position, which is for a sort of reasonable, moderate imperialism, and not the sort of madcap, lunatic imperialism of the Republicans. So the addiction to hopefulness on the one side meant that a very large section of people who were in the anti-war struggle, imagine in February of 2003, there were maybe 10 million people around the planet protesting against the war. Even the New York Times' Patrick Tyler had to admit that there remained two superpowers on the planet, one the United States and the other, what he, I think rather silly, called it world public opinion. Actually, it's not world public opinion, it was the global anti-war movement. But still, there was a sense at that time that there was a united front, as it were, against the anti-war dynamic, against militarism. But of course it was only a united front against the bad wars. And the moment Obama came into office, the anti-war platform that we had started to, sort of lose steam, because a section of the population put their faith not only in Obama to prosecute then the good war, which is Afghanistan, but to close down Guantanamo, to stop using black sites, etc. In fact, of course, it was George Bush who used to arrest terrorists, and it is Obama who kills them. But that is not for me to say too often. Because some people take offense at that. So the first reason why I think it's important to have something like UNAC, it will help us revive from, I think, the bottom, the anti-war platform, which I think till April 9th had become rather moribund. When UNAC appeared on April 9th in New York City, I think it was a message that the anti-war movement has been refounded and is going to be revived. That's the first reason why I think the UNAC position is important. The second reason is that during the anti-war period from 2003, or at least 2002 maybe, till the election of Obama, the principal vehicle, ideological position against the war was against excessive war. But there was very little understanding of the twin processes of imperialism and Islamophobia. That is, nobody really in the anti-war movement felt comfortable talking about Islamophobia. They might talk about racism. You know, in a way it's like MIA's video on how prejudice against redhead people can happen. You know, in other words, you make racism banal. You know, it's against everybody. All racisms are the same. But actually, in the last decade or so, there has been a particularly sharp attack against real Muslims and those who get mistaken for Muslims. In other words, those who accidentally look like terrorists, which is really the heart of Islamophobia. And I think what was very important in this refounding of the anti-war position has been the linkage of imperialism and Islamophobia. In other words, this formation, it seems to me, in its program, in its platform, says that we oppose imperialism and we oppose Islamophobia. And believe me, we are going to enter now this season of hate. When we come to the 10th anniversary of 9/11, on September 11th, the climate of anti-Muslim hatred is going to rise exponentially. The media is a delightful ally in fanning the flames of hatred. And in that media, there are people like, you know, Bill O'Reilly and others. Glenn Beck now has cried himself to the web. But there is Bill O'Reilly and others, and they will be really pushing the Islamophobia message hard. So that's one. And secondly, the 10th year anniversary of Afghanistan is going to show up. And as you know, in honor of that, the United States has created a new continent in the world. No more North Africa, Middle East, South Asia. Now the United States has created a geographical space which I consider to be the drone lands. The drone lands go from Libya to Somalia to Yemen, out to the borders between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, the second reason why UNAC is important is it has linked in its essence the processes of Islamophobia and imperialism, and it has said we need to combat both. So for these two reasons, because we need to refound a real anti-war presence, and we need to refound that presence on the basis of against imperialism, against Islamophobia, and that is why I'm very happy to be here. I think this is going to be an essential movement building exercise for us. Now, you have invited me here to talk about Libya mainly, but Libya, of course, has to be put in the context of the Arab Spring. So what I thought I'd do is I'd give you a quick dossier of how I see things where they stand. I'd like to talk a little bit about my understanding of US interests in the region, because that I think is important for us to understand why the United States, or what my theory is for why the United States is in this region so strongly. And thirdly, I would like to talk a little bit about the emergence of alternatives to militarism in the world. And then maybe we can also have some time to talk about how the anti-war movement should position itself, or could position itself, against this bout of militarism as the election season opens. So first, where are we? Well, you know, of course, as we all know, the Arab Spring took place, and sadly, as a few months have gone by, the enthusiasm seems to have waned for it, and it should not wane, because it is extraordinary that the people of Egypt, after 30 years of struggle, you know, these struggles didn't come from nowhere. The media is very silly, you know, Facebook, youth, they don't understand anything. Nobody reads a damn thing. They don't even bother to read Wikipedia, you know. Where I went and checked today, there was an entry on older strikes in Egypt, you know. I mean, there is a history of peasant struggles, union struggles in Egypt, and struggles of professionals. You know, there were lawyers for change, there were teachers for change, there were strikes by police officers. You know, there's been a great sense of disgruntlement in Egypt for 30 years at least. 53% of the country lives under the poverty line. You know, this is not a country where everybody is somehow in thrall of the great pharaonic state. This is a country which has been restive for many decades. And some breakthroughs took place. One of the great things that you can read about in Lenin is how unexpected the moment is when a breakthrough comes and when revolutionary situations appear. You cannot predict it. It's conjunctural. And luckily, in a sense, for world history, last year the Russian wheat harvest failed. And because the Russian wheat harvest failed last year, bread prices have gone crazy across the planet. In North Africa, bread prices used to be subsidized by the regimes, and thanks to their neoliberal prejudices, they had decided some years ago to cut back on bread subsidies. And struggles against the rise in basic commodity prices, fuel prices, food prices, etc., had broken out from last year. And there was, as it were, concatenation of events. They break in Tunisia first, and then in Egypt, and this incredible thing happens. The thing that inspired people, the masses, as it were, formed themselves politically in Tahrir Square, refused to leave when the thugs came to beat them. It was, of course, the organized section of the masses that took on the thugs initially. If you go back and watch the video, pictures of when the people come in on camelback, you see these young men just break away from the crowd and form a line. I have no sympathy with the theory that revolutions happen only spontaneously. They may happen spontaneously, but they are defended through organization. Because when the counter-revolutionary forces entered, it was the Muslim Brotherhood that went out there and defended the people in the square, and many died. Whatever I think of the Muslim Brotherhood, they were certainly an organized force, able to create a wall to protect the square from the people who came in on camels with sabers and such. At any rate, please don't allow ourselves and to allow the media to dampen the importance of what has happened in Egypt and Tunisia. These are spellbinding, important developments. The revolutions there have not ended. They will continue. First a long march through the electoral process, and then who knows where it will go. Trade unionists in places like Suez have demands that far exceed the electoral process. But yet, I think it's going to go through the electoral institutions, and I don't know where it's going to come out. As you know, the United States and France in Tunisia and the United States in Egypt, were both very uneasy when these revolutionary situations broke out. The United States had too much to lose to allow its great friends in Egypt to be overthrown. And of course, President Obama sends his great squire, Frank Wisner Jr., to hold Mubarak's hand and to try to allow Mubarak to see the wisdom of creating more, enthusiastic reforms. And Wisner, who has no such subtlety, in a press conference said that, Mubarak should be allowed to cement his own legacy. The people in the square were not interested in Mubarak's legacy. They had other things in mind. But the United States was not particularly enthusiastic about what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia, despite what is now being said. Caution against the revisionism of contemporary history. The United States now is trying to take credit. The New York Times obscenely is writing essays saying that Gene Sharp wrote a handbook which was used by the people in the square. Most of the people in the square had never heard of Gene Sharp, and they didn't need his handbook on, sort of anemic post-Martin Luther King kind of civil disobedience. They had their own traditions, they had their own ideas. They didn't need some kind of handbook produced by an American academic to help them understand that they didn't like the pharaonic state. So caution against this revisionism. It is going to come hard, it is going to come fast, and it was full-blown in Obama's speech on the Arab Spring, where he took it upon himself to declare virtually that his speech in Cairo was what opened the doors to the Arab Spring. Now remember, in Tahrir Square, people were chanting, when you came to Cairo, you said, we extend our arms, don't reply with a fist. Now they said, we are extending our arms, why are you replying with a fist? Because they were holding up tear gas canisters which said, of course, made in the USA. Yeah. The few things we make in the USA are armaments, and that's what they were demonstrating for us. So, caution against the revisionism. Well, it was unfortunate for the United States that that wave, as it were, spread to Bahrain. And of course to Yemen. But first Bahrain. That was the misfortune of the United States. Because Bahrain is an anchor for American power. It is the home of the American Fifth Fleet, and as well it is a proxy state of Saudi Arabia. Now this year Bahrain is going to run out of oil, and therefore this 180-year-old monarchy is going to become even more dependent on their senior monarchs in Saudi Arabia. And Bahrain's collapse would have at least hurt one of the principal, if not two of the principal pillars of American foreign policy. I just mentioned them now, I'll come back to them later. One, the idea that Iran has to be held back from exerting itself into the so-called Arab world. And the second pillar is that nothing must happen to prevent the flow of oil. And Bahrain threatened these two essential pillars. Bahrain had to be stopped. But how to stop Bahrain if this enthusiasm was spreading everywhere? And if Americans here were also on Facebook cheering on our Egyptian and Tunisian comrades, saying, yes, continue, let us have all the crowns in the air. Let the Khalifa crown fly like the crown of Mubarak. Let them all go and live in the Novotel Hotel in Riyadh. You know, let them all go to exile in Saudi Arabia, including the Saudi monarchs. You know, there was a great enthusiasm at the... So how do you stop Bahrain, which would have been completely inexcusable? American power would have actually been fundamentally set back in Bahrain. It was not set back in Egypt, and we can come to that if you want to ask about that. But Bahrain it would have been. At that moment, Libya provided a historical opportunity. And Libya is a curious country. Again, there have been struggles against Gaddafi that go back to the 1970s. You know, I'm not one for, you know, praising the brother leader this or brother leader that. You know, that is not really essential any longer. It is true, of course, that Gaddafi, unlike Mubarak, unlike Ben Ali, unlike the Al-Khalifas, etc., had a very important and historically progressive role to play between 1969 and the early 1980s. You know, when he nationalized the oil companies, when he threw out the Americans from their bases in Libya. I mean, people don't remember, the United States had a major base in the Wheelus, what was known as the Wheelus Air Force Base, north of Tripoli. It was a principal place from which bombing raids were conducted in World War II, both in North Africa and in Southern Europe. I mean, that was the major US base in North Africa. And Gaddafi removed the Americans from that base. That used to be previously a British base, before that a Luftwaffe base, and before that an Italian base. Because the Italians were the first to conduct aerial bombardment in the 1920s against Libya. Libya is where aerial bombardment starts, and the Italians began it there. In fact, by the way, when the Italians were bombing Libya, the Futurists in Italy were praising aerial bombardment. Because, you know, they have art but no politics. And that was a disaster. They wrote poems in praise of incendiary bombs flying from the skies, etc. Okay. Gaddafi had a historically progressive role between 69 and the early 80s. But by the early 80s, when the Libyan revolution, or his revolution, had run aground, some serious problems had happened for him. But there were 3 or 4 quick dissenting streams that will feed into this current rebellion. One, Libya, like many post-colonial states, is a country formed out of the past without a real historical development. You know, there was no historical development for the forming of Libya. Libya was cobbled together out of 3 vilayats of the Ottoman Empire. And 2 of them in particular had a great divide. Tripolitanata in the west and Cyrenaica in the east. There was a historical divide. After World War II, when the Americans got the Wheelus base, one of the deals was that the Europeans had to leave, or Libya had to be free, but the United States would enter now as a sort of protective entity with the base, and a king of Libya would be appointed. And King Idris, when he was appointed after World War II, was from the eastern part of Libya. He was from the Sanusi sect. He was, you know, popular in some sections in eastern Libya, and he was the king of Libya until 1969. So there is this east-west divide, a historical divide. When Gaddafi overthrows Idris, he will favor the western part and the southern part of Libya. You know, the deep deserts and the western part, not the mountains. We can get to that later. Why are the fighting now so intense in the mountains? Nafusa, Berbers, others are fighting like it. What is happening? But this section was favored by Gaddafi, even though Gaddafi's own hometown of Sirte is in the center of the country. Okay, so that's one important cardinal divide. Another divide that's important to keep in mind is that there was a great deal of disgruntlement with how Gaddafi was governing. I mean, it was a centralized state. he will say we have the greatest democratic structure. In fact, his son was at the LSE, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, gave a speech where he said, you can watch it on YouTube, he said, we have the greatest democracy in the world, and people started laughing, and then he also started laughing, and then he kept saying, in theory, in theory. I imagine heir apparent laughing about his own country like that, crudely, and saying, in theory, we have the greatest democracy. Certainly it was not. Which is why there were currents that were deeply unsatisfied with the Libyan regime, and they took various forms. One of them was certainly a turn to political Islam, inspired more by the Algerian civil war and the FIS party, the Islamic Salvation Front, rather than anything like Al-Qaeda. So that section again is in eastern Libya largely. In fact, many of people from that political tendency found themselves in Iraq fighting against the Americans. And they claimed that they could not fight against Gaddafi, so they fought against the closest thing, which is America. The second stream. Third stream is a stream of young people, professionals within the Libyan state sector. Some of them had become lawyers who were dissatisfied with the increasingly authoritarian nature of the state. In 2006, during the Danish cartoon controversy, there was a protest in Benghazi. It was smashed by the state, 11 people killed. Young lawyers came out to defend those who had been killed and arrested. One of them was a young lawyer by the name of Fateh Terbil. That's the third stream. The fourth stream is the following. From the 1990s, Gaddafi had turned the country away from the kind of national liberation path towards in a complete, almost in a sense you could say, a harmonious relationship, attempted harmony with the West. And he did that in several different ways. One, he brought his closest friend, Musa Khusa, by the way, who has another interesting history. He was in London as the ambassador in the 1980s and expelled from there because in London he gave a speech saying that all stray dogs should be killed, by which he meant Libyan dissidents. And 2 Libyan dissidents had been killed. He was expelled from England. But in the 1990s, he was picked by Gaddafi because he was a suave, sophisticated man to travel the West and to take care of this bad relationship that Libya had. One of the mechanisms to improve relationship was to pay blood money for Lockerbie. So Musa Khusa traveled the capitals and was making deals around Lockerbie and arranging how much money. He was essentially trying to placate things. Then there was a second section who was again in touch with the Americans and the Egyptians, wanting to bring, this is in the late 1990s, bring Libya fully into the anti-Islamism kind of movement that had developed. The fear of terrorism, how to tackle terrorism. Gaddafi knew that he had a problem in the East, and he basically called most of the Eastern dissidents Islamic terrorists. So a relationship is going to develop which will tighten after 2001, after the United States inaugurates the war on terror. And many American prisoners captured by the Americans will be brought to Libya to be tortured, including Sheikh al-Libi, who dies in prison. Sheikh al-Libi is from eastern Libya, and when he died, there were thousands of people in his hometown that came to commemorate his death. So, by the way, the number 2 of Mubarak, who the United States had almost tried to anoint as the next leader, Omar Suleiman, was somebody claimed that he directly participated in torture in eastern Libya. Okay? Anyway, so this tendency of Gaddafi trying to create a deal with the West goes through the period of the 90s and into the 2000s. Meanwhile, his son Saif al-Islam Gaddafi is going to be the privatizer-in-chief inside Libya. And he brings in people like Mahmoud Jibril to run the privatization and efficiency making of the state structure. That's the fourth section of this rebellion. One is the eastern part, and then the Berbers to some extent in the west. So the regional element, then Islamism. Then the third is these young lawyers and others who have a problem with the increasingly authoritarian state. And the fourth is people who were part of the Gaddafi apparatus to create convergence with the West, but fell out with it eventually. Particularly, opportunistically, they fell out after February 15, 2011. So Jibril, Shokri Ghanem, Musa Kusa, all of them were tightly part of this apparatus in Libya that was using the Gaddafi regime to push neoliberal privatization and a kind of pro-Western position from Tripoli. Since the movement taking inspiration from Tunisia and the 5th anniversary of the 2006 protests against the cartoon, was set to break out on the 17th of February, Gaddafi preemptively arrested the organizers on the 15th, and that section of the sort of right wing of the Gaddafi establishment defect to Benghazi. Now, for the United States, this provides a huge opportunity. How better to take charge of the dynamic in the Arab Spring than to defend this particular uprising as the most authentic uprising, democratic uprising in the region? Because here these are people who've already established themselves as extremely close to the Pentagon, to the World Bank, to those institutions. Okay? Now let me link Libya to Bahrain. The United States had to deal with the fact that the Europeans wanted a rather strong resolution against Libya, against the threat of genocide. Gaddafi's tanks are moving on the cities, moving on Benghazi particularly. The Europeans were right in there. Partly it was, Bernard Henry Levy, the great Che Guevara of the French right, who showed up in Benghazi and said, "Bring the Mirage fighters, bomb me, I am ready to be killed in the service of freedom," etc. And Sarkozy, already with the government embarrassed deeply by the close complicity with Tunisia, was also enthusiastic to wash away their own bad history, contemporary history. And Sarkozy started to make very maximalist demands about Libya. That resolution 1970 is passed. It was actually a good resolution. No arms to anybody, the violence must cease, open talks, there's got to be a different way. In the light of the Arab Spring, let us not reduce this to bombs, etc. That was resolution 1970. But it was, of course, not enough for Sarkozy, certainly not enough for Susan Rice in the UN. And what then happens is, from February to March, as the Egyptian struggle is increasing and gaining tempo, as the Tunisian struggle is both ended in one sense when Ali leaves, but then the protests continue, and as Bahrain picks up, the United States and the French push for a second resolution in the UN. Now, my thought was, why do they need a second resolution when there was a pretty good resolution already? They began to amp up the rhetoric that civilians are going to be killed. Meanwhile, civilians were being killed in Bahrain, but there was no question of any UN resolution. Civilians were being killed brutally in Yemen. There was no question of any UN resolution, which is why I was puzzled when some of our friends on the left got themselves so excited about Libya. When they then said, well, just because it's happening in Bahrain doesn't mean we have to not support it in Libya. I mean, I've lived long enough to know any imperialist intervention is a bad idea when it claims to be on the side of civilians. I mean, and you don't even have to have lived that long because, if you're just 10 years old, you know that when they said they're going to Afghanistan to help Afghan women, well, good luck Afghan women, because they're currently cutting a deal with the Taliban. So I don't think they really mean what they say, So, I mean, I found that a curious position to take, particularly because something was happening under the radar. Our media, again, they don't read history. They don't actually look at things outside what the Europeans and Americans are saying. What was the Arab League doing? And what was happening in Saudi Arabia? Well, curiously, or maybe not so curiously, the Saudis were very eager to help out the French and the Americans vis-a-vis Libya. And they wanted the Arab League to come in and say, some kind of intervention is necessary to stop what is happening in Libya. A deal is cut between the Saudis, and it's a very open deal. The deal is cut, the Saudis talk about it, which says the following: the Saudis will deliver the Arab League to the American and French position vis-a-vis a new resolution in the UN, but then the United States has to allow the Gulf Coordination Council to act in Bahrain. And that is exactly what happens. Saudis will publicly push the Arab League will support intervention, Resolution 1973 goes through. It's a terrible resolution, totally ambiguous. It goes through, the bombing begins, and you'll then notice Ahmed Musa, the head of the Arab League, says, I didn't know there was going to be bombing. Hastily, Ban Ki-moon grabs him by the ear. They have a press conference in Cairo, and in Cairo, he says, actually, I support the resolution 100%. Meanwhile, in the causeway that divides Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, the Saudi army crosses, and they crush the resistance in Bahrain. That was the deal. That was what was happening with Resolution 1973. The United States goes in. Now, I discovered just by accident that one of the leading generals in the rebellion on the Libyan side used to live near Langley, Virginia. And the day I wrote about this, my God, my computer had some sort of fireworks display. I don't know, somebody was very interested in what was in my computer that day. But it was quite simple. Somebody called me up and said, just see why this guy was living in Virginia. It's an American accent, anonymous phone call. It turned out he lived 7 miles away from Langley. He was a general in Gaddafi's army in Chad in the 1980s. He defected from the army, and I came here, younger, but I came here, I've stood in many lines, immigration lines. I've begged officials who sit above you. I've been humiliated, all the typical things. But of course, we all want to get into the best country in the world, so you put up with it, right? But this guy, he went from the battlefield of Chad to an address in Vienna, Virginia. How does that happen? How does he live in Virginia for so many years, and then how is it that just when the rebellion gets interesting, he is parachuted into Benghazi to lead the military part of the resistance? Anyway, alright, forget it. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't have any evidence, I'm just telling you all the material I know. Okay, that's all I know. It's curious how the rebellion then so quickly gets into the pocket of the United States and the Europeans. Now, one thing I'll say, that even though I know people in this rebellion, and personally, and I know that it's got some authentic people, they have great resentment and anger at Gaddafi, I share those things with them. But any movement that is reliant on imperialist forces will have no freedom of maneuver if they win tomorrow. Because tomorrow, guess who's coming back to Wheelers Air Force Base? The United States has been trying to have its African command based in Africa. All African countries have said, not a chance, you cannot create African command in Africa. AFRICOM therefore is based in Stuttgart in Germany. But if Libya goes to the American column, Wheelers Air Force Base is going to be the home of AFRICOM. Please write that down. In 1 or 2 years, please write to me and say I was wrong. It will make me happy. But I don't think so. I think if this turns out the way it's going to turn out, that's exactly what's going to happen. Nothing like having a huge Air Force base between Egypt on one side and Tunisia on the other. Libya is strategically located in Africa. Okay. So that's Libya. I can get into the details. Why in the north are they fighting here? It's basically a stalemate. And it's going to be a stalemate, and we can get into the history of the military and all that. Fine. Let's leave that aside for a few minutes. Let's go to what is America's interests. So, I wrote a thing, I said that oil is of course essential. The oil has to continue to flow to our cars and such like, but oil, we cannot allow it to overdetermine our thinking. There is the economics of it, there is also the politics of it. Oil must flow, Iran must go. These are their two slogans, basically. Okay, these are the two slogans. There are 4 pillars, 4 essential things for American power in the region. One, as I said, is oil. The other is Israeli interests, absolutely essential. You might say they're irrational. Who am I to say what happens in the brains of constitutional lawyers and other people who are so smart, jobs at Harvard University? I don't know. These people are superior to me. I don't presume to know why they feel so obliged to support Israel. It's their decision, not mine. But certainly full and utter, and in fact, more support of the Israeli state than some sections of the Israeli people. In some instances. Third is the war on terror should not be harmed. That is essential. And the fourth is Iranian so-called revisionism must be blocked. These are the 4 essential pillars of American power interests in the region. Oil, Israel, war on terror, and Iranian revisionism has to be stopped. Those are essentially the four. In these cases, these are all apparent. I mean, if you look at why the United States must collude with the Saudis and the Bahraini royal family, it's clear that there the issue is oil, Iran, and war on terror. I mean, there is a geography of why the eastern rim of the Saudi or of the Arabian Peninsula is so threatening, because it's a majority Shia area, and there has been decades of protests. You know, it just happens that in this region, the working class and professional sections are largely Shia. So the rulers, they very conveniently have sectarianized the conflict. So they will say the Wafiq party, for instance, is the fifth column of Iranian, it's going to hand over Bahrain to the Iranians. Actually, they have demands and interests far greater than anything to do with Iran. But that is a great fear. If you want to know who actually has improved Iran's position in the world, it's not the young working class people of eastern rim of the Arabian Peninsula, it's the United States. The United States gifted in the last 10 years Iran a huge victory. Two of its historical enemies were removed. On the one side, Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist party, and on the other side, the Taliban. You know, Iran was hemmed in by two great enemies. The United States gave a huge gift to Iran, removing them. So, if you actually want to prevent Iranian revisionism in the region, you're doing a pretty bad job. You know, you need to fire somebody if it's a results-based enterprise. But apparently, the US government is not a results-based enterprise. So, this is allowed. So these four pillars, I would say, are the essential ones. You know, and we can talk about, you know, how they are important. There's some contingency in these. Sometimes some policies work against the pillar. Like the war in Libya, in the short term, works against the pillar. After all, Gaddafi had opened the spigots at the highest volume, sending the sweet crude to Europe and elsewhere. So it's not like he was blocking the oil. So sometimes the pillar contingently may be effective. But there are larger issues at stake. And the larger issues at stake in Libya had nothing to do with Libya, but everything to do, I will suggest to you, with Bahrain, and therefore with Saudi Arabia. That was the trick in this equation. Okay. Now, quickly I'll talk about what are alternatives. So, there's an addiction to war. Anytime there's something, must go to war. The smoke screen of helping civilians is extraordinary. And you know, we need to really fight hard against that, to remind people, without being too sort of crazy sounding, that, you know, our beloved land of the free doesn't have the best history in protecting people outside the land of the free. You know, and there are many examples of our ability to screw things up. You know, for instance, we need to demonstrate to people, I think, that aerial bombardment has a terrible history of delivering countries to freedom. You know, so that's one thing, that this idea that suddenly at every few years we can reinvent the notion that now military power can be used for good, you know, has to be put an end to. And there we have, ironically, three very important women in the White House pushing the humanitarian intervention line: Susan Rice, Samantha Powers, and Hillary Clinton. Okay, so that line has to be somehow damaged. What else could we do? Well, we need to pay attention, or somehow we need to utilize, you know, understand, pay attention to how US power and how US power utilizes ideology to get its way. Now, Resolution 1973 was being debated in the Security Council. Susan Rice, in the last minute, added one small clause to the draft resolution. And by the way, nobody in the American media reported this particular thing. If you had to be sitting in the chamber listening to them deliberate to understand what she was doing. What she said was, there will be no use of, blah, 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 we will not side, etc. We will not, comma, generic language. There will be no giving of arms, there will be no, generic language. Then it says, we will support, member states are enjoined to support Resolution 1973 by all necessary means, comma, notwithstanding Resolution 1970. That notwithstanding Resolution 1970 is a deadly thing. That's all that Rice added in. Member states are enjoined to support, to provide all necessary means, okay, to uphold Resolution 1970. Not why? That means that you can provide arms to the rebels. Because Resolution 1973 said arms sales to both sides are prohibited. Member states must provide all necessary means, comma, notwithstanding Resolution 1973. The Russians picked this up and in the meeting said, this is ambiguous. Of course, being Russians, they just said it and then sat down. I'm coming in a second to the Russians and the Brazilians and others. They just indicated. And others felt it, which is why there was some pushback. This clause is dangerous. The French, on I think 29th June, said that they dropped arms in the mountains, Berber region, in the northwest of Libya. Now, understand that in the northwest of Libya, a rebellion has broken out. In the Nafusa mountains, a rebellion, and it's an old rebellion. Berber people have a huge history of desiring autonomy from Algeria, from parts of Morocco, from, it's a Kabyle struggle. A very long tradition of fighting against what they see as the Arabs of the low areas. Okay, many of them, if you go to France, by the way, the best rye clubs are Kabyle clubs, actually, not Algerian. They are the Kabyle. They broke out. Their rebellion was not about Tripoli. It was about autonomy. They did not want to advance from their region towards Tripoli. They want the Libyan state to disappear. They want a kind of enclave for the Kabyle. The French have been trying to egg them on to move out of the mountains into the plains. Why? Eastern front has been blocked, basically. There's been no progress along the Tripoli-Benghazi road. The progress is all happening in the western mountains. So now they drop arms in the western mountains. They are essentially trying to get them to move out of there. I don't think it's going to happen. The Kabyle are not going to come into Tripoli. They are not interested in Tripoli. They think of Tripoli as another country. It's like believing if there was an American Civil War that the people in Texas would actually like to occupy Boston. I mean, they would say, no, we want autonomy for Texas. We don't want anything to do with these, elite liberals in New England. In the same way, the Kabyle would say, why would we go to Tripoli? It's a den of iniquity. It's not what we desire. We want our hills. We want our autonomous region. Those are the ways in which ideologically things happen.